Imagine being born into a family so twisted, so entangled, that you arrive in this world carrying two impossible titles, a daughter and an aunt. This is no riddle, no folklore. This is a true story of lineage so corrupted by secrecy and taboo that it defies nature itself. Tonight, we unravel the strangest family tree in history, one that bends the very laws of blood and kinship. Welcome to Eerie Records, where history's darkest and most unsettling truths are brought back to life. Here, we explore the hidden corridors of the past, the secrets whispered in shadows, the stories too strange to be believed. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what hour of the night finds you here. Subscribe and join our dark family as we journey deeper into history's most haunting mysteries. In the annals of family histories, tangled branches are nothing unusual. Cousins marry cousins, alliances blur names, and generations fold upon themselves. But what happens when those branches twist so tightly they form an impossible knot? Our story begins with a lineage that defied sense, a bloodline where children were born into roles they should never have held, where a girl could stand in two places at once, both niece and sibling, both daughter and aunt. To understand how such a paradox could occur, we must first travel back to Europe in the late 17th century, where noble families guarded their blood with a fierce and unrelenting obsession. Dynasties thrived not by expanding outward, but by collapsing inward, binding their heirs to one another, generation after generation, in the name of purity, wealth, and power. In France, Spain, and even the isolated courts of Austria, marriage was never about love. It was about legacy. The ruling families believed their bloodlines were sacred, destined by God, and must be preserved from dilution at all costs. And so they arranged unions not across nations, but across dining tables. Brothers married nieces, uncles wed their own kin, and cousins were shackled together in bonds that twisted nature's order. The Bourbon dynasty of France, and their Spanish counterparts, were particularly infamous for this practice. Within their sprawling castles and candlelit halls, the pursuit of pure blood gave rise to children who bore the heavy burden of genetic consequence. Children whose faces carried the unmistakable mark of their tangled ancestry. Some were frail, others plagued by lifelong ailments. Yet the nobility pressed forward, convinced their line was too holy, too divine to risk corruption from outsiders. It is here, in the shadows of these dynasties, that we find the roots of our story. Records whisper of one such child, a girl born into a family tree so ensnared in itself that her birth fractured reason. By blood, she was her father's daughter. By lineage, she was also his niece. And through another warped tie, she was her own aunt. How can such a thing be? How can one person occupy roles that contradict themselves? To grasp the horror of it, we must trace the branches backward, through marriages of convenience, through unions both legal and whispered, through generations of choices that blurred the very meaning of family. This is not merely history. It is a Gothic labyrinth of identity, where the titles of mother, sister, daughter, and aunt collapse into one. A place where the word family becomes a riddle, and where the birth of a child tells a story stranger than fiction. Tonight, we begin to unravel that riddle. To uncover how such an impossible birth could occur, we must examine the very heart of Europe's most powerful dynasties. For centuries, families such as the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of Spain clung to a singular obsession, blood that remained untainted. It was not merely a matter of pride, it was politics, faith, and survival. In the 17th century, the House of Habsburg reigned over a vast empire. Their crest was feared across Europe. Their armies marched under banners of supremacy. Yet, behind the grandeur of their palaces lurked a secret enemy, one of their own making. For the Habsburgs, like many royal houses, refused to look beyond their own kin when arranging marriages. A daughter was betrothed not to strengthen alliances with foreign princes, but to tighten the noose of blood around her own house. Uncles wed nieces, cousins exchanged vows, and sometimes, far worse occurred under the guise of tradition. Their reasoning was clear. The more contained the bloodline, the less chance of losing power to outsiders. But with each generation, their plan bore a cruel harvest. Children who inherited not just titles and crowns, but ailments, deformities, and frailties that spoke louder than any decree. The most haunting emblem of this practice was King Charles II of Spain, born in 1661. His family tree was less a tree and more a circle, its branches folding inward until there was no escape. Charles was the son, nephew, and cousin of his own relatives. A child woven entirely from recycled bloodlines, his body betrayed the weight of this lineage. His jaw jutted grotesquely, his speech slurred, his health crumbled year after year. Historians note that Charles was so frail he could not walk until the age of 8. He was monarch in name, but in truth, a prisoner of his own ancestry. It is within this same world, this suffocating cycle of intermarriage, that we find the case of our unnamed girl. Unlike Charles II, whose tragedy is etched into history books, her story lingers in the margins, preserved only in fragments of records, whispered accounts, and genealogical puzzles that still baffle historians. She was not royalty of the highest order, but her family was bound by the same logic. By binding themselves too tightly, they created an heir who could not be placed neatly on any branch. She was by birth the daughter of her father, yet through the labyrinth of marriages and entanglements, she was also his niece, and because of yet another twisted connection, she stood as her own aunt, an impossibility, rendered real by centuries of decisions driven by pride and fear. This is not myth, it is not fable, it is the inevitable consequence of dynasties that tried to defy nature itself. By the mid-17th century, Europe's aristocracy was not merely obsessed with power, it was entangled in a web of kinship, so twisted that even genealogists struggle to trace the lines without losing their way. The story of the girl who became her own aunt emerges from this very maze, a human riddle carved into family records. The confusion begins not with her, but with her parents, if the word parents can even be used without hesitation. Her father was also her uncle, a man who had taken his brother's daughter as his wife. In an age when the church held authority over both marriage and morality, such unions should have been forbidden. Yet dispensations were easily secured for those with titles, and the bloodlines continued to twist tighter. This young woman, our subject's mother, was herself a product of consanguineous marriage. Her lineage already carried the scars of repetition, fragile health, shortened lifespans, and a pattern of infants who did not survive beyond their first year. When she bore her daughter, the birth was not merely another addition to the family. It was an echo, a mirror folding back on itself, where roles collapsed into one another. To the world outside, she was simply a child, but to those who examined the family tree, she was something else entirely. Through one branch, she was her mother's daughter. Through another, she was her father's niece. But with the way marriages intertwined, she also occupied the role of aunt to her own siblings, a paradox that confounded neighbors and relatives alike. It is here that the whispers began. Parish records in certain provinces reveal priests struggling to note the child's position within the family. Margins of birth registers contain notations, questions, and even subtle remarks about irregularity. One document, dated 1674, bears a chilling Latin phrase beside her name, monstrum genealogicum, a genealogical monster, and yet she lived. Unlike so many children born into weakened dynasties, she survived infancy, walked, spoke, and grew into adolescence. But survival came at a cost. Accounts describe a girl who seemed marked by strangeness. Her features bore the unmistakable stamp of repeated bloodlines, an elongated jaw, a high forehead, a frailty that caused fainting fits and bouts of illness that lingered for weeks. Her identity was never stable. Was she daughter, niece, aunt? In truth, she was all three, and none completely. Families tried to silence the confusion, to present her in public as though she were ordinary. But behind closed doors, the shame festered. Mothers whispered prayers, fathers argued with priests, and the girl herself became a living reminder of choices made generations before she was born. In her veins flowed not just blood, but the accumulated secrets of centuries. She was both heir and warning, a mirror held up to dynasties that believed they could control fate itself. As the strange child grew into her adolescent years, her existence became both a fascination and a quiet scandal within her household. Servants whispered in the kitchens, carefully avoiding her gaze as she walked by. They called her La Sobrina Dama, the niece lady, because no one could decide which role truly belonged to her. Her education was marked by this same uncertainty. Tutors, often imported from distant provinces, arrived eager to instruct a girl of noble blood. Yet within weeks they departed in unease, claiming their services were no longer required. One tutor's letter, preserved in fragments, confessed. The girl asks questions that should not belong to a child. She demands to know who she is, yet I cannot answer without offending God himself. Physically, she bore the burden of her lineage. She suffered fevers that left her bedridden for weeks, her complexion pale as wax. Witnesses noted her fragile frame, so slight that gusts of wind seemed to unsettle her balance. And yet when she recovered, she displayed an unnerving sharpness, an intelligence, that made her seem older than her years, as though centuries of tangled ancestry had given her a memory that was not her own. The household attempted to control the narrative. When visitors arrived, she was introduced only as the daughter, her more perplexing titles concealed. But gossip travelled faster than discretion. At church, parishioners glanced sideways when she entered. Some crossed themselves, murmuring that no child should occupy the role of both aunt and niece. One account even claims that during confession, a priest struggled to address her, faltering over whether to call her filia, daughter, or soror, sister. Adolescence brought new pressures. Families of similar rank began to inquire about potential matches. For in those days, marriages were alliances of land, wealth, and legacy. But how does one arrange a marriage for a girl whose very blood defied the laws of kinship? To marry her into another line would risk spreading the paradox further. To keep her unmarried risked extinguishing a branch entirely. Her parents, already burdened by their own transgression of blood, hesitated. They held secret meetings with church officials, attempting to secure yet another dispensation. But even the church, an institution that had tolerated countless dynastic unions, hesitated in this case. One bishop reportedly declared, "This union has birthed a riddle, not a child. To bind her further in marriage is to challenge the order of creation itself." Thus, she lived in suspension, neither fully accepted nor entirely cast out. A daughter too strange to present proudly, too important to abandon. Her every step was watched, her future uncertain, her very name becoming a whispered curse in the halls of her estate. She was no longer just a child. She was becoming a symbol, an omen, of what happens when power bends nature, until it breaks. By the time she reached her 17th year, the girl had become both a treasure and a threat to her family name. Noble blood flowed in her veins, yes, but that same blood circled back upon itself, tangled in ways that horrified even those accustomed to dynastic unions. In an age where daughters were measured by the alliances they could forge, she was a puzzle no one dared solve. Her parents, desperate to secure her future, quietly reached out to neighbouring families. Couriers carried letters sealed with wax, proposals written in the careful language of diplomacy. The responses, when they came, were polite but unmistakably cold. Some never replied at all. Others cited vague concerns about health, heritage, or God's natural order. The implication was clear. To marry her was to invite ruin into their bloodline. One suitor, a young baron's son, was persuaded to meet her in person. Records say he was enchanted at first, remarking on her delicate features and striking intelligence. But during a dinner hosted in her honour, a slip of the tongue revealed her infamous title, born her own aunt. The young man paled, set down his goblet, and never returned. Within weeks he was married to another woman, his family insisting the match had been arranged long before. Whispers multiplied. In marketplaces and taverns, the story of the unmarriable heiress spread. Some called her cursed, others a living punishment for her parents' sins. In certain villages, mothers warned their children, "Do not look too long at her, lest her fate follow you home." Superstition clung to her like a shadow, heavier with each passing year. Meanwhile, she grew restless. Denied the ordinary paths of womanhood, she turned inward, devouring books, maps, and manuscripts left to gather dust in the family library. She studied histories of her lineage, tracing its roots back generations, as if searching for an explanation, or perhaps an escape. Servants claimed she often wandered the halls at night, murmuring to herself in Latin prayers mixed with questions no priest could answer. The church remained undecided about her. Local priests alternated between pity and suspicion, some calling her a lamb abandoned by shepherds, others whispering that she was a warning from heaven itself. One chronicler described her confession at age 19. She asked if her soul could be saved, when her very birth was unnatural. I told her that God sees all children as his own, but in truth, my voice trembled. Rejected by suitors, doubted by priests, yet bound to her family's estate, she entered adulthood with no clear path forward. She was a woman who could not marry, a daughter who could not fully inherit, a figure trapped between belonging and exile. But history does not forget anomalies. And as the century wore on, her name, whispered in scandal and superstition, would come to symbolize something far greater than one woman's strange fate. By her 21st year, the weight of expectation had grown unbearable. In noble society, an unmarried daughter was a loose thread, a potential scandal waiting to unravel an entire house. For her family, the matter was worse. She was not merely unmarried, she was unmatchable. And yet, as the only surviving child of her line, she was the natural heir. But how does one inherit when their very existence is deemed unnatural? The death of her father in 1742 brought this question into sharp focus. His estates, vineyards, farmland, and a modest castle should have passed directly to her. Instead, distant cousins arrived like vultures, presenting their claims before local magistrates. Their argument was simple, cruel, and effective. A woman born of such a tangled union was unfit to hold noble property. Some even dared whisper that her blood was so corrupted it could not be trusted to govern servants, let alone rule land. The legal battle was fierce. In candlelit chambers, lawyers pored over genealogies, tracing branches of her family tree that looped back on themselves, like a serpent devouring its own tail. One priest, called to testify, declared, "The child is both niece and sister within her own house. Can such a creature claim legitimacy in God's eyes?" His words spread like wildfire, bolstering the cousin's claim. And yet she did not yield. She stood before magistrates herself, clad in mourning black, and argued with startling eloquence. "I was not consulted in the arrangement of my parents' vows," she said, her voice steady, "but I was born upon this earth as any other child. If inheritance is blood, then mine runs true, whether you find it pleasing or not." For a time, it seemed her defiance might carry the day, but the church intervened, summoned to Rome for review. Her case became not merely a local dispute, but a matter of ecclesiastical law. Scholars debated whether a woman in her position should be considered fully human in lineage, or some form of monstrum, a term used in canon law for those born under signs of sin. The verdict was chillingly ambiguous. Her inheritance was restricted, divided among cousins, though she was permitted a small portion as charity. Thus, she returned home dispossessed, an heiress in name only, stripped of her rightful lands by the very system that had engineered her fate. The peasants who lived near her estate began to spin darker tales. They said her family's fall was no accident, but divine justice. They whispered that at night, when the moon was high, she roamed the fields in silence, staring at the land that was hers but would never truly belong to her. It was in these years of loss and exile that her legend began to grow, not merely as a woman born her own aunt, but as a symbol of cursed inheritance, an omen whispered across Europe. By the mid-1740s, her private sorrow had escaped the boundaries of her estate and seeped into Europe's wider imagination. In taverns, in markets, and even from church pulpits, her name, or some distorted version of it, was invoked as a living parable. She was no longer merely a woman robbed of inheritance. She was a cautionary tale, a whispered warning of what happens when families bend the laws of God and man. Printed pamphlets, cheap and easily spread, began to circulate. Some carried woodcut illustrations of twisted family trees, their branches looping back into their own roots. Beneath these images ran bold captions: "The abomination of kin," or "The girl who was aunt to herself." Her actual name was often omitted, replaced with mocking titles: "The folded child," "The ancestral knot," or simply "The error." Sermons grew darker. In Paris, a Dominican preacher thundered from his pulpit, "If the house of man dares to mock the house of God, behold the fruit, a child-born aunt to her own self." Do you not see the devil's laughter in this? His words drew gasps, and some claimed women clutched their children tighter, as though fearing such a fate might spread like plague. But the fascination was not purely moral outrage. It was also grotesque curiosity. Scholars debated her case in hushed academic halls. Was she in fact an anomaly of lineage, or merely an unfortunate caught in the gears of legal terminology? Philosophers whispered of her as a living challenge to Enlightenment ideals of order and reason. Voltaire himself, though never naming her directly, is rumoured to have referenced a most perplexing lady in Spain, whose family tree devours itself like Ouroboros. For the woman herself, the torment was unbearable. Strangers began appearing at her gate, students seeking to see her face, pilgrims believing her cursed body carried prophetic meaning. Some begged her to bless them, others spat upon the ground and called her an insult to creation. Children dared each other to run up to her window, claiming to have seen her shadow bent in impossible shapes, and yet, through it all, she remained silent. Her writings from this period, only fragments survive, suggest a weary detachment. "They call me monster," one line reads, "yet the monster is not my birth but their endless gaze upon it." Another fragment, smudged and nearly illegible, seems to plead, "Will no one let me be simply human?" But history does not often grant humanity to those it transforms into symbols. In time, she ceased to be remembered as a daughter or heiress, and became something colder, a living allegory, a grotesque reflection used to frighten children, to scold noble families, and to entertain the morbid curiosity of strangers. Her story had left her hands. She was now an artifact of fear, a parable trapped in flesh. By the late 1740s, the woman who had once been a noble heiress now lived like a shadow within her own ancestral home. The shutters remained closed most days, the gardens grew wild, and neighbours whispered that the great house was cursed. They said that at night, the halls echoed with the sound of a woman speaking to herself. Two voices, yet only one figure pacing by candlelight. Whether these stories were born from superstition or sharpened by gossip, they gained weight with each retelling. A maid who once worked in the house claimed that her mistress forbade mirrors, insisting that reflections carried uninvited eyes. Another servant spoke of finding folded scraps of paper in strange places, under pillows, behind doors, even buried in pots of soil, bearing the same desperate phrase again and again, "I am not what they say." Her relatives, uneasy and embarrassed by her notoriety, kept their distance. The estate, though still hers in title, had grown neglected. Yet paradoxically, the more abandoned she became, the more crowded her legend grew. Travellers passed through the region just to glimpse her shuttered windows. They pointed to a cracked upper pane and swore they saw her standing there, pale and unmoving, as though carved from wax. The church, having used her case as a moral warning for years, began to shift its tone. Local priests whispered that perhaps she was touched by the supernatural, a vessel for God's punishment, or worse, the devil's amusement. Her story slipped from legal oddity into the realm of Gothic fable. By 1752, pamphlets had evolved into ballads sung in taverns. Sailors told of the woman who bore her own aunt, shaping her into something almost mythical. Children dared one another to chant her name in darkened rooms, certain she would appear. In this way, she became less a person than a ghost haunting the imagination of Europe. In her final surviving letter, penned in trembling script, she seemed resigned to her fate. "The world no longer sees me," she wrote, "but the shadow they have painted in my shape. I am more phantom than woman now, even as I yet draw breath." Her death, when it came, passed quietly. No chronicler recorded her last words. Some claimed she died alone in her chamber, candlelight still flickering upon the walls. Others whispered she vanished entirely, leaving only an empty gown folded upon her bed. Both versions fed the legend, which by then cared little for facts. To this day, no grave can be pointed to with certainty, and perhaps that is fitting. For in life, she was denied the dignity of being only herself. In death, she became something more elusive, a myth, a parable, a spectre whose family tree tangled not only her bloodline, but the very imagination of all who heard her tale. By the mid-18th century, her name had already taken root in the taverns and chapels of Europe. But legends are like seeds scattered by the wind. They do not stay where they are born. Sailors carried the tale aboard merchant ships, priests carried it in sermons, and soon the woman who had once walked the cobbled streets of Madrid became a phantom whispered of in the colonies of the New World. In Havana, the story shifted into a warning told to young women: "Marry wisely, lest you birth both kin and curse." By the 1760s, Fragments of her tale appeared in journals kept by Spanish priests in Mexico City, who wrote of a European lady who bore her own aunt, a mark of divine displeasure. They used her as evidence that sin could twist bloodlines into impossible shapes. As the story leapt the Atlantic, it shed much of its specificity. Her name grew vague, her estate blurred into a haunted manor, and her letters, once filled with anguish, were retold as riddles left in locked rooms. In Virginia, colonists repeated her tale at night as a fireside ghost story, warning of bloodlines so cursed they tangled into knots no human hand could unravel. But the strangest part is not how far the story travelled, it is how it adapted. In the Caribbean, she became fused with African folklore of shapeshifters and spirits that could live in two bodies at once. Among enslaved communities, the woman, born her own aunt, became a symbol of survival, proof that even when blood was twisted by violence, life could not be extinguished. In New England, Puritan ministers used her as a sermon's cautionary note. They framed her as the ultimate example of mankind's arrogance in trying to play God, pointing to her bloodline as a sin made flesh. To them, her very existence was evidence of divine judgment, an omen not of one family, but of humanity's fallen state. By the turn of the 19th century, she was no longer just a woman. She had become folklore. Her face never described the same way twice. Her fate never concluded with certainty. Some swore she haunted ships that crossed the Atlantic, appearing to sailors in storm-tossed nights. Others believed she wandered plantation fields at dusk, her shadow cast in two directions at once. It is difficult to say whether those who repeated the tale still knew she was once real, flesh and blood, trapped in a cruel twist of genealogy and rumor. Or perhaps that was the final theft of her identity, to be remembered only as a ghostly riddle carried by mouths that never knew her name. Centuries have passed since the woman whispered about as born her own aunt last drew breath. Yet her shadow has not faded. Instead, it has slipped into folklore, genealogy debates, and even modern science, where researchers still stumble upon cases that blur the very definitions of family, identity, and inheritance. In the 20th century, her story resurfaced among geneticists investigating rare conditions of genetic chimerism, when two sets of DNA exist inside one body. Doctors, astonished, found echoes of her legend in real biology, where mothers carried traces of their children, and siblings bore the silent imprint of one another in their blood. Though medicine gave these mysteries a name, the legend of the woman born her own aunt remained far stranger than any textbook could capture. In villages across Spain, she is still remembered not as a medical case, but as a cautionary tale. In hushed voices, elders say she walks at night, searching for her own reflection in the family lines that twisted her into existence. In South America, the story took another turn. She is called La Tía Maldita, the cursed aunt, a phantom said to appear whenever bloodlines cross where they should not. And in genealogy forums today, the legend still sparks debate. Was she real? Was her family tree truly so entangled that it created this impossible paradox? Or was she merely a woman destroyed by gossip, transformed into something monstrous by the hunger for scandal? The truth, buried beneath centuries of retelling, may never be known. What we do know is this. The story has endured because it strikes at something timeless. The fear that our families may not be as simple, as pure, or as linear as we imagine. That in the shadows of every lineage lurks a secret too strange to face. Perhaps that is why her tale survives when so many others have been forgotten. It is not just the strangeness of being born your own aunt. It is the reminder that families hold within them both love and ruin, blood and betrayal, memory and myth. And so, when you hear her name, or what little of it remains, remember that her life was once real, that she lived and suffered, that her story, though twisted into ghostly legend, began with a woman who simply longed for peace. But if you happen to hear whispers in your own home, when the night grows still, ask yourself, are they only echoes of your family's past? Or could it be her, still searching, still restless, still caught in the endless knot of a family tree that defies all reason. This has been another descent into the forgotten corners of history, where truth and legend blur into something haunting. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time of night? Subscribe to Eerie Records and join the dark family, where history's most chilling secrets never rest.